The sky over Europe in 942 was a battlefield like no other in the history of mankind. While the charged clouds concealed bombers that cut through the icy air at 6,000 meters altitude, enemy fighters plunged from the heights like metallic hawks in constant surveillance. In this intense aerial theater, where the challenges faced by bomber pilots were immense, a remarkable transformation began to take shape. Young Americans arriving at British airfields, many still with the dust of Kansas farms or the smell of the California sea on their clothes, were about to revolutionize air warfare in ways not even their most optimistic commanders could have predicted. This is not just a story about technology or numerical superiority. It is the narrative of how an entire culture, forged in the vast plains of America, the open skies of the Midwest, and the pragmatic mindset of a young nation, produced a generation of aviators who would adapt, learn, and dominate the skies of war with a speed that would leave allies and enemies alike impressed. It's about how young men who had never left their hometowns turned into masters of three-dimensional warfare, surpassing veterans with years of combat experience. Before we continue this extraordinary journey through the skies of the Second World War, I would like to ask you to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment saying what time you are watching this documentary. Your support keeps this content alive and helps us keep telling these fascinating stories of history. To understand why American pilots adapted so quickly, we must first go back in time, even before the United States officially enters the war. As the British Royal Air Force fought desperately against the German Luftwaffe during the summer of 940, the Americans watched with increasing attention. But watching did not mean simply watching. American officials were documenting, analyzing, studying every aspect of the air conflict with a meticulousness that would become characteristic of their approach to war. American mentality was fundamentally different from the beginning. While many European air forces were rooted in centuries-old military traditions, with rigid hierarchies and established doctrines, American military aviation was relatively young, flexible, and not burdened by the weight of decades of tradition. The United States had entered World War I late, and its air force was in many ways still a child compared to more established European air forces. But this youth, rather than being a weakness, became a crucial advantage. Without ingrained dogmas about how air warfare should be conducted, Americans were free to absorb lessons from all sides and create their own solutions. America of the 19th and 40s was a nation built on innovation and pragmatism. It was the country of Henry Ford and his revolutionary assembly line, of Thomas Edison and his countless inventions, of Wright brothers who had conquered powered flight only decades earlier. This was a society that valued results above tradition, efficiency above protocol. When faced with a problem, Americans were trained from childhood to find practical solutions, not to cling to methods that did not work simply because they had always been done that way. In addition, American education produced a different kind of soldier. In the years leading up to the war, the United States had invested heavily in public education, and literacy rates were remarkably high. More importantly, the American education system emphasized critical thinking and problem-solving in ways that many more traditional European systems did not. The young men who would become pilots had grown up repairing tractors, building amateur radios, dismantling car engines. They were a generation of natural inventors and problem-solvers. When the time finally came for the United States to enter the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 941, this unique mindset was channeled into one of the most ambitious aviation training programs ever devised. The United States Army Air Force's aviation training program was not only large in scale, it was revolutionary in approach. While other nations trained pilots in relatively small numbers, the Americans built an industrial training machine that would eventually produce hundreds of thousands of aviators. But quantity without quality would be useless, and American planners knew it. The training program they developed was simultaneously intensive and comprehensive. Pilot candidates spent months in instruction on the ground, learning not just how to fly but why planes flew, how engines worked, the principles of meteorology, navigation, and air tactics. This fundamental knowledge meant that when these men finally arrived on European battlefields, they were not just pilots who knew how to follow orders. They were airmen who deeply understood their machines and could improvise when things did not go according to plan, which in war was often the case. The training also incorporated lessons that were being learned in real time in the skies over Europe and the Pacific. In a notable example of rapid adaptation, Combat reports were analyzed and lessons were incorporated into training programs in a matter of weeks, not months or years. If pilots in the European theater discovered a new German tactic, instructors in Texas or Arizona would be teaching countermeasures before the end of the month. This speed of institutional adaptation was unprecedented and gave American pilots a huge advantage before they even went into combat. But training was only part of the equation. Technology has played an equally crucial role in the ability of American pilots to adapt quickly. And here, again, the American approach was distinctive. While many countries treated their fighter planes as almost sacred machines, designed by brilliant engineers who knew better, Americans saw their planes as tools that could and should be constantly improved based on feedback from users, pilots, and mechanics who actually operated these machines on a day-to-day basis. When the first American pilots arrived in England to begin combat operations, they came with planes that, while impressive, were not perfect for the conditions they would encounter. The Boeing B-17, the Flying Fortress, was an engineering marvel, but its early missions revealed vulnerabilities. Rather than accept these limitations as an inevitable part of war, American engineers and commanders worked tirelessly to modify and improve the design. Additional armor has been added in vulnerable areas. Armament was reinforced and repositioned. Oxygen systems were perfected for the high-altitude flights. And crucially, these changes were implemented quickly, with aircraft being modified in the field based on recent combat experiences. This philosophy of continuous improvement extended beyond airplanes to every aspect of air operations. Americans were bigots for data and analytics. After each mission, there were extensive debriefings where every aspect of the flight was discussed and documented. Which formations worked best? At what altitudes did enemy fighters prefer to attack? Which evasive tactics were most effective? These were not just casual conversations, they were structured data collection sessions that fueled a continuous cycle of analysis and improvement. American systematic approach to air warfare was personified by figures such as Colonel Curtis LeMay, who would become one of the most effective commanders of the war. LeMay was obsessed with efficiency and accuracy. He saw the bombing not as an exercise in individual bravery, but as an engineering problem that could be solved through careful analysis and disciplined execution. Under his leadership, bomber groups developed training techniques that maximized defensive capability while maintaining bombing accuracy. He introduced rigorous training practices that ensured that each crew member knew exactly what to do in any given situation. But LeMay and other American commanders also understood something fundamental that took time for other air forces to learn, that flexibility was as important as discipline. They encouraged initiative among their pilots. If a tactic was not working, the pilots had the authority to adapt at the time, without waiting for orders from above. This combination of thorough preparation and freedom to improvise when necessary created an air force that was simultaneously disciplined and adaptable. The American military leaders who emerged during the Second World War were, in many cases, fundamentally different from their counterparts in other nations. Men like Jimmy Doolittle, Hap Arnold, and Carl Spaatz were not aristocrats or products of elitist military academies. Many of them had begun their careers as practical pilots, men who loved flying and understood aviation from the inside out. They spoke the same language as their pilots because they had walked the same path. This closeness between leaders and pilots created an environment where information flowed more freely. A young lieutenant who discovered something useful in combat did not have to navigate endless layers of bureaucracy to share his discovery. He could often speak directly to senior officers who were genuinely interested in hearing what he had to say. This openness dramatically accelerated the speed with which new tactics and techniques were disseminated through force. Consider the development of long-range fighter escort, one of the most crucial innovations of European air warfare. In the early days of the daytime bombing of Germany, American bombers faced significant challenges because they had no fighter escorts to protect them throughout the mission. The available fighters simply had no range to accompany the bombers to deep targets in Germany and back. This was a serious technical problem that threatened to make the entire strategic bombing campaign unsustainable. The solution came through a characteristically American combination of ingenuity, pragmatism, and a willingness to experiment. Engineers worked to develop disposable fuel tanks that could dramatically extend the range of the fighters. But it wasn't just the engineers working in isolation. Fighter pilots contributed ideas about where the tanks should be mounted, how they should be released, and how the extra weight would affect the performance of the plane. Field mechanics suggested modifications that made installation faster and more reliable. The result was transformative. When the P-51 Mustang, equipped with external tanks and engine improvements, entered service as a long-range escort at the end of 1943, it fundamentally changed the balance of air warfare over Europe. For the first time, bombers could fly anywhere in Germany with escorts of powerful fighters at their side. Operational results improved significantly for the Allies. And crucial to our history, all of this happened with remarkable speed, from recognizing the problem to implementing the solution in a matter of months. But rapid adaptation was not just about technology and tactics. It was also deeply personal, about how individual pilots dealt with the intense stress of air combat. And here, again, American cultural characteristics played an important role. American culture emphasized optimism and a belief that problems could be overcome through hard work and ingenuity. This mindset was incredibly valuable in combat, where maintaining morale and focus was essential to success. American pilots also benefited from a rotation system that, while not perfect, was generally more structured than that of other air forces. Bomber pilots, for example, were required to complete 25 missions before being eligible for rotation back to the United States. This system had its criticisms, certainly, but it also gave men something concrete to fight for, a light at the end of the tunnel. And crucially, it meant that seasoned veterans would eventually return to the United States where they could share their experiences with the next generation of airmen in training, creating a virtuous cycle of knowledge transfer. Psychological support, while limited by modern standards, was also taken seriously by Americans. There was growing recognition that combat stress was real and that all men had their limits. Chaplains and medical officers worked to identify men who needed additional support and provide assistance, either through temporary respite from combat operations or simply having someone to talk to. American bombers flew with crews of 10 or more, and these men became incredibly close. They trained together, flew together, and shared all the challenges of the mission. This unity cohesion was not accidental. It was cultivated through training that emphasized teamwork and through policies that kept crews together whenever possible. A pilot was not just fighting for his country or for some abstract cause. He was struggling to bring his friends back to safety. This personal, concrete motivation was powerfully effective. The very missions that American pilots flew were tremendous tests of adaptability. Consider a typical deep bombing mission in Germany at 1944. The crew would wake up before dawn, often after only a few hours of sleep. They participated in a briefing where they learned the target of the day, the route, the altitude, the expected opposition. Then came preparation, wearing electrically heated flight suits to freezing high-altitude temperatures, checking equipment, loading trucks into the airfield. Takeoff alone was dangerous, with heavy bombers loaded to the limit with fuel and bombs struggling to gain altitude. Once in the air, the formation had to be established, with dozens of planes maneuvering to their designated positions. Then came the long journey to the target, hours sitting in extreme cold, with nothing but clouds and occasionally a glimpse of the ground far below. And always the tension growing, knowing that enemy fighters could appear at any moment, that flak would start to burst around them as they approached the target. When the opposition came, it required instant adaptation. German fighters could attack from any direction, often from the sun where they were difficult to see until the last second. Gunners had to track moving targets at speeds of hundreds of miles per hour, responding to targets that appeared and disappeared within seconds. Pilots had to maintain training while performing evasive maneuvers, a task that required extraordinary skill and concentration. And the navigator and bomber had to do their jobs even during high-pressure situations, because accuracy was essential to mission success. The ability of American pilots to perform these complex and dangerous missions with increasing effectiveness over time was testament to their adaptability. In the first months of the 1943, the challenges were significant and many missions failed to hit their targets with any precision. But with each passing month, performance improved. Formations were refined to provide better mutual defense. Bombing techniques were perfected to improve accuracy. All of this was happening as they continued flying combat missions, learning and constantly improving. The experience of fighter pilots was different but equally demanding in terms of adaptability. Air combat was even more fluid and unpredictable than bombing. An aerial confrontation could start in seconds and end in less than a minute, with results decided by fractions of a second and meters away. Fighter pilots had to develop what was often described as an almost supernatural situational awareness, an ability to track multiple friendly and enemy planes simultaneously while piloting their own machines at the limit of their performance. And here, again, Americans have shown remarkable ability to learn and adapt. In early encounters with veteran German pilots, Americans often fared poorly. But the Americans studied each encounter, analyzing what had worked and what had not. They learned to use the advantages of their own planes, the superior diving speed of the P-38, the high-altitude maneuverability of the P-51, while avoiding situations where German advantages such as climbing and turning at low altitude could be exploited. American pilots have also developed a more methodical and disciplined approach to combat than many of their opponents. While some German aces were brilliant pilots who relied heavily on individual skill and instinct, Americans emphasized teamwork and tactics. Pairs of pilots flew together, covering each other, never separating even in the heat of battle. This meant that an American pilot was rarely alone against multiple enemies, a situation that even the most skilled pilot would have a hard time surviving. The history of air warfare in the Pacific offers another perspective on American adaptability. Here, the challenges were different but equally demanding. Distances were vast, often involving hourly flights over open ocean with no landmarks. The tropical climate brought its own problems: violent storms, high humidity that affected equipment, oppressive heat in already uncomfortable planes. And the enemy, Japanese pilots, were formidable adversaries with their own significant advantages, especially in the early years of the war. Again, Americans learned and adapted. They developed navigational techniques over water that allowed for reliable long-range flights even without visual landmarks. They modified planes to better cope with tropical conditions. And crucially, they learned to fight the Japanese in ways that neutralized Japanese advantages while exploiting weaknesses. The famous boom and zoom, diving at high speed to attack and then climbing back to safety altitude before more maneuverable Japanese planes could react, was a tactic developed specifically for Pacific conditions. When high-altitude bombing of Japanese industrial targets proved ineffective due to high-altitude winds and difficulty locating targets, General Curtis LeMay, now commanding bombers in the Pacific, made the bold decision to switch to low-altitude attacks at night. It was a dramatic change of tactics that involved significant risks, but LeMay was willing to challenge established doctrine because analysis showed it was necessary. This campaign again demonstrated the American willingness to adapt tactics radically when the situation demanded it. As the war progressed, another American advantage became increasingly important: the sheer scale of resources. American industrial capacity was simply overwhelming. At the height of production, American factories were producing thousands of planes a month. This abundance meant that American pilots always had planes to fly, spare parts were available, and new improved models were constantly introduced. While the German Luftwaffe languished for lack of fuel and spare parts, American pilots flew the most modern and well-maintained machines. But it would be a mistake to attribute American success only to material superiority. Many nations have had great resources at various points in history without achieving the same results. What made Americans special was how they used these resources, the way resources were combined with superior training, innovative tactics, effective leadership, and a culture that valued adaptation and continuous improvement. Consider the development of the 29 Superfortress B bomber, the weapon that would eventually deliver the atomic bombs that would end the war. This was not only a better plane, it was a technological leap, the most advanced bomber in the world when it entered service. But even this wonderful machine had significant problems in its early development. Computerized control systems failed. There were literally hundreds of problems that needed to be solved. A less adaptable Air Force could have given up or delayed the program for years. Instead, Americans attacked the problems systematically. Engineers worked 24 hours a day to resolve issues. Test pilots flew dangerous missions to identify problems. Changes were implemented quickly, with modifications being retroactively installed on planes already in service. In less than a year, the 29B was transformed from a problematic aircraft into a highly effective weapon of war. This ability to identify problems, develop solutions, and implement them quickly on an industrial scale was quintessentially American. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen pilots offers another important dimension of this narrative. These African-American airmen faced not only the dangers of aerial combat, but also prejudice and discrimination from their own nation. Initially, many doubted that black men could be effective military pilots, a prejudice based on pure racism without any factual foundation. The Tuskegee Airmen proved these skeptics terribly wrong, becoming one of the most effective fighter groups of the war. Their ability to adapt not only to the challenges of combat but also to the injustices they faced at home demonstrated extraordinary resilience. The performance of the Tuskegee Airmen was so impressive that bombers often specifically asked to be escorted by airmen with red-tailed badges. And although full integration of the American military still took years after the war, the excellence demonstrated by these men began to challenge racist attitudes and open doors. It was further evidence that adaptability and excellence were not issues of race or social class, but of training, opportunity, and determination. As 1944 gave way to 1945, the Allied air supremacy over Europe was absolute. The once formidable Luftwaffe was reduced to a fraction of its former strength. German pilots, many of them now with limited training due to the difficulties faced by Germany, faced experienced Allied airmen in increasingly unfavorable conditions. And among these Allied airmen, Americans stood out not only for their numbers but for their effectiveness. Operational performance was constantly improving, and the challenges faced, while still significant, had declined compared to the first days of the 1943. This transformation had taken less than 3 years. 3 years from the first challenging days when inexperienced American pilots faced veteran adversaries with often difficult results, to the establishment of air superiority over Europe. 3 years of constant learning, adaptation, innovation, and improvement. 3 years that demonstrated what a culture of pragmatism, flexibility, and determination could achieve. It is worth considering what did not work because this is also part of the adaptation story. Americans have made mistakes, many of them. Pre-war doctrines about heavily armed bombers being able to defend themselves without fighter escorts have proven to be misguided. Early tactics in aerial combat were often inadequate. Equipment failed in unforeseen ways. Intelligence was sometimes incorrect. But what separated the Americans was not the absence of mistakes. It was how they responded to mistakes. Instead of denying problems or blaming individuals, there were honest investigations to understand what had gone wrong and how it could be avoided in the future. This culture of admitting mistakes and learning from them was embedded from the top. Commanders like Hap Arnold and Carl Spaatz were not infallible, but they were men who could recognize when they were wrong and change course. This humility at the leadership level created an environment where everyone felt able to admit mistakes and seek improvements, which greatly accelerated the organizational learning process. The contribution of the Allies should also not be forgotten. Americans arrived in Europe and learned a lot from the British, who had been fighting for years when the first American pilots arrived. The British generously shared their hard-earned knowledge about everything from night bombing techniques to effective use of radar. American pilots flew alongside British, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Polish, Czech, Free French, and many others, and learned from all of them. But while learning from others, Americans also contributed their own innovations. The concept of precision bombing in daylight, for example, was primarily American. The British had attempted daytime bombing early in the war and had faced significant challenges, prompting them to switch to nighttime area bombing. The Americans, with their heavily armed planes and sophisticated bombardment sites, were determined to make the daytime bombing work. And despite the initial setbacks, they eventually succeeded, although the cost in human lives was considerable. This determination to pursue a strategy even when others had given up, combined with willingness to adapt methods when necessary, was characteristically American. As the war neared its end, veterans of the air campaign began to reflect on their experiences. Many recognized that they had changed profoundly. Young men who had gone to war as inexperienced boys returned home as men who had seen and done things they had never imagined. They had flown through extremely dangerous conditions. They had witnessed the profound impacts of the conflict. They had lost comrades. And they had survived through a combination of skill, training, camaraderie, and, Many would admit considerable luck. But these experiences, traumatic as they were, had also forged a remarkable generation. They had discovered reserves of courage and resilience that they did not know they possessed. And they had developed skills and knowledge that would serve them and their nation well in the post-war decades. Many would become leaders in civil aviation, helping to build the commercial aviation industry. Others would use their leadership and problem-solving experiences in completely different fields. Some would become teachers, sharing their experiences with future generations. The story of the rapid adaptation of American pilots has lessons that go far beyond military aviation or even World War II. It demonstrates the power of a culture that values flexibility over rigidity, results over tradition, and continuous improvement over complacency. It shows that even when faced with formidable adversaries and seemingly insurmountable challenges, people with the right training, the right support, and the right mindset can adapt and prevail. It is also a story about the value of diversity of thought. American pilots came from all corners of the United States, bringing different perspectives and experiences. Some had grown up on farms, others in cities. Some were the children of recent immigrants. Others traced their lineages back to the nation's founders. This diversity meant that when problems arose, there were many different minds working on them, each bringing their own unique ideas. And while not every idea was good, the sheer amount of innovation that resulted from this intellectual diversity was powerful. There are also lessons on the importance of investing in people. The United States has spent enormous resources training its aviators, not just teaching them to fly but educating them widely. This investment was expensive both in terms of money and time, but it paid incalculable dividends. Well-trained pilots were more likely to survive, more effective in combat, and better able to adapt to changing circumstances. The initial cost of training was trivial compared to the value of having top-quality aviators. And perhaps most importantly, history demonstrates that adaptation is not a single event but an ongoing process. The American pilots did not adapt once and then stopped. They kept learning, adjusting, improving through the whole war. Each mission was an opportunity to learn something new. Each challenge was a chance to develop new solutions. This perpetual improvement mindset was critical to their success. When we look back through the decades to those dramatic years, it's easy to romanticize or oversimplify. The reality was complex and often challenging. More than 50,000 American airmen lost their lives during the Second World War. Each of them was a son, brother, husband, or father whose future was disrupted. Many more survived physically but carried the deep marks of these experiences for the rest of their lives. Air warfare required great sacrifice. But within these challenges, there were also moments of extraordinary courage, remarkable ingenuity, and deep camaraderie. There were men who risked their lives to save wounded crewmates, mechanics who worked through the night to ensure that planes would be ready for the next morning mission, commanders who reflected deeply on decisions knowing that every order they gave had direct consequences for the men under their command. There was humanity in the midst of the challenges, and it is this humanity that makes the history of these people so powerful and relevant even today. As we come to the end of this journey through the skies of the Second World War, it is worth reflecting on what these stories mean to us today. We live in a world very different from that of 1940. The nature of the war has changed. Technology has advanced in ways that those fighter and bomber pilots could never have imagined. But the fundamental principles that allowed American pilots to adapt so quickly remain relevant. The importance of quality training, of effective leadership, of a culture that embraces change rather than resisting it, of humility to admit mistakes, and courage to try again. These things are timeless. In a world that continues to change at a rapid pace, where new technologies and new challenges constantly arise, the ability to adapt quickly is more valuable than ever. The lessons learned by those young aviators 8 decades ago can teach us a lot about navigating our own uncertain future. They show us that successful adaptation does not only require material resources or superior technology, although these things certainly help. It requires the right mindset, the willingness to learn, the courage to change when needed, and the perseverance to keep trying even when success seems distant. And perhaps most of all, the story of American pilots in the Second World War reminds us of what humans can achieve when they are tested to the fullest. Those men faced one of the most hostile and dangerous environments ever created and not only survived but eventually dominated. They did this not because they were superhuman or fearless, but because they were well-trained, well-led, and supported by a nation that gave them the tools and resources they needed to succeed. And because they refused to give up, even when the odds seemed overwhelmingly against them. Its story is one of the great narratives of courage, adaptation, and final triumph of the Second World War. It is a story that deserves to be remembered and told to new generations, not to glorify war, which should always be the last resort, but to honor those who served and to learn from their experiences. The lessons they bought with such sacrifice are part of their legacy for us, and we owe them not to forget. May the Lord God, in His infinite wisdom and mercy, continue to bless those who have served with courage, and may He guide all future generations in the search for peace and understanding among the nations, so that the sacrifices of those brave airmen have not been in vain.